Welcome to Timeless Witnesses. Imagine, you are a 15-year-old boy, shivering on a cold marble floor. The fire in the corner of the room flickers, reflecting the walls carved with erotic myths, while the laughter of philosophers echoes from the floor above. They say Athens is the cradle of civilization, but to you, it is a gilded cage. The symposium above echoes with laughter and philosophical debate. Socrates himself might be among the voices discussing virtue and justice, while you wait here like a beautiful ornament, prepared for whatever entertainment the evening's guests might desire. The irony isn't lost on you, even at your age. These same men who spend their days crafting laws about proper conduct and debating the nature of moral excellence have very different ideas about morality when wine flows and darkness falls. Your master Critias paid 300 drachmas for you at the slave market last month. More than most families see in a year, not for your ability to tend fields or craft pottery, but for the curve of your jaw and the way your eyes catch torchlight. A servant girl no older than yourself enters carrying fresh towels and more oil. She avoids your gaze, understanding that acknowledging your shared humanity would make what's about to happen even more unbearable. You both know the rules of this world, where beauty is currency and youth is a commodity that depreciates with each passing season. Above you, someone quotes Homer, while another voice argues about the ideal forms of government. Their intellectual discourse, a thin veneer over appetites that would shock the very citizens they claim to represent. Welcome to ancient Greece, not the sanitized version you learnt about in school, where democracy and philosophy shine bright enough to blind us to the shadows behind the marble columns. Tonight you'll discover what really happened when the symposiums ended and the scrolls were set aside. When the men who shaped Western civilization revealed appetites that history has spent centuries trying to forget. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Athens you're lying in during 420 BC bears little resemblance to the idealized version most people imagine. Yes, this is the city of Pericles and Plato, of the Parthenon and groundbreaking democratic experiments. But it's also a society where approximately half the population exists as property, where citizen men exercise absolute authority over wives, children, and slaves, and where sexual practices considered criminal today were not just tolerated but celebrated as expressions of refined culture. Your master Critias belongs to the Athenian elite, wealthy enough to own a dozen slaves, educated enough to engage in sophisticated philosophical discussions, and connected enough to host symposiums that attract the city's most influential citizens. His house sprawls across nearly an entire city block, its interior courtyards filled with imported sculptures and mosaics depicting scenes that would make a modern viewer blush. But Critias didn't acquire his wealth through honest trade or noble birth. He's a hetaiotes, essentially a pimp, who manages a stable of beautiful boys and young men for the entertainment of Athens' upper class. The symposium culture that defined elite Athenian social life created the perfect environment for practices that modern society would classify as systematic child abuse. These weren't occasional lapses in judgment or isolated incidents of misconduct. They were institutionalized customs woven into the fabric of Greek intellectual and social life, defended by the same philosophical traditions that gave us concepts of justice and virtue. Plato himself in his dialogues describes relationships between older men and teenage boys as the highest form of love, more noble than marriages between men and women, because they supposedly transcended physical desire to reach spiritual truth. This philosophical framework provided intellectual cover for what was essentially a culture-wide system of sexual exploitation that consumed thousands of young lives, while their abusers congratulated themselves on their sophistication and moral refinement. The preparation rituals you've endured represent just one small part of a complex economy built around the sexual exploitation of youth. Every morning, you're bathed in water scented with imported perfumes, your skin rubbed with oils that cost more than most citizens earn in a month. Your hair is styled according to current fashions, long curls that frame your face in a way designed to emphasize your youth and supposed feminine qualities. Even your diet is carefully controlled, with foods chosen not for nutrition, but for how they affect your skin tone and body development. But the physical preparation pales beside the psychological conditioning that shapes every aspect of your existence. You've been trained to anticipate the desires of free men before they're spoken, to respond to subtle gestures and coded language that would be meaningless to an outsider. You've learned which guests prefer submissive silence and which are excited by displays of apparent resistance. Most importantly, you've learned to dissociate during the worst moments, to float above your own body while maintaining the appearance of willing participation. The other boys in Critias's household have taught you the unspoken rules that govern your survival. Never show genuine emotion during encounters with guests. It either breaks the fantasy they're purchasing or triggers violence from those who enjoy causing real pain. Never form close friendships with other slaves. Masters deliberately separate boys who show affection for each other, understanding that emotional connections threaten the isolation that keeps victims compliant. Never resist directly. Open defiance results in beatings, starvation, or sale to owners whose cruelties make your current situation seem merciful by comparison. Tonight's symposium promises to be particularly elaborate. Critias has spent weeks preparing, importing exotic foods and rare wines, while carefully selecting which boys will be presented to which guests. You've overheard conversations between the household staff about special requests from certain attendees. Men whose reputations for cruelty have spread throughout Athens' underground networks of slaves and servants. A guest list reads like a directory of Athenian intellectual and political leadership. There's Alcibiades, the brilliant military commander whose beauty and charisma are matched only by his reputation for sexual excess. Xenophon will attend, the historian whose writings will someday be studied by scholars who have no idea about his private appetites. Even Critias himself, your master, is a respected philosopher and politician, a man who writes eloquently about justice and virtue while operating one of the city's most notorious brothels. These men don't see their behavior as contradictory, because Greek culture created elaborate intellectual frameworks that justified the exploitation of those they considered inferior. Slaves, women, and foreign-born residents existed in different moral categories than free male citizens. The virtues that governed relationships between equals simply didn't apply to interactions with property. A man could be generous to his neighbors, just to his peers, and cruel to his slaves without any sense of inconsistency. The philosophical schools that made Athens famous developed sophisticated arguments for why these practices represented the height of civilized behavior. They claimed that relationships between older men and younger males fostered intellectual development, that the beauty of youth inspired philosophical contemplation, and that sexual relationships based on inequality taught valuable lessons about power and submission. These weren't rationalizations created after the fact. They were integral parts of Greek intellectual tradition, taught alongside mathematics and rhetoric as fundamental aspects of proper education. As footsteps approach your chamber, you prepare for another evening of what your masters call education. But what you experience is carefully orchestrated trauma. The oil on your skin has warmed to body temperature, and you've arranged yourself in the pose that Critias prefers: vulnerable, but not obviously terrified. Available, but retaining enough apparent dignity to make your submission feel meaningful to those who will soon claim it. The door opens with a soft scrape of bronze against marble, and torchlight floods the small space where you wait. Critias enters first, his expensive himation draped in perfect folds that speak of hours spent with skilled servants. Behind him comes tonight's first guest, a man whose face you recognize from previous gatherings, whose preferences you remember with the clarity that only trauma can provide. Your childhood ended months ago when you first passed through the slave market's gates, but tonight will mark another kind of death, the final dissolution of whatever hope you still carried, that someone somewhere might intervene to save you from this beautiful hell disguised as the pinnacle of human civilization. The symposium above grows louder as more guests arrive and wine begins to flow freely. Soon they'll discuss the nature of love while practicing its most corrupted forms. Debate the meaning of justice while perpetrating systematic injustice, and celebrate the achievements of their glorious democracy while treating human beings like commodities to be consumed and discarded. You watch from the marble floor as Critias adjusts his himation with practiced elegance, the purple-dyed wool falling in perfect folds that cost more than entire families earn in a lifetime. His guest tonight is Callicrates, a man whose weathered hands speak of military campaigns but whose eyes hold the same hunger you've learnt to recognize in all the symposium's regular attendees. A torchlight catches the golden fibula that secures his cloak, a piece of jewelry worth enough to purchase a small farm. Yet he wears it casually while preparing to use a human being like a cup of wine. The boy has been prepared according to your specifications, Critias murmurs, his voice carrying the same tone he might use when discussing the quality of imported figs. Fresh oils from Egypt, bathed in rose water, positioned as you requested. The evening's entertainment awaits your pleasure. Callicrates circles you slowly, his sandaled feet clicking against the marble with deliberate precision. Each step echoes in the small chamber like a countdown to inevitable violation. You've learnt to read these preliminary inspections, the way potential users evaluate your compliance, assess your fear level, decide which particular cruelties will provide them the most satisfaction. Your muscles remain perfectly still, despite every instinct screaming for you to run, to fight, to do anything except lie here like an offering on an altar, dedicated to the appetites of men who write poetry about honor. The conversation above your prone form reveals the casual sophistication that makes Greek sexual culture so particularly disturbing. These aren't crude barbarians acting on base impulses. They're educated intellectuals who have developed elaborate philosophical justifications for their behavior. Callicrates discusses his recent reading of Sappho's poetry while running his fingers along your oiled skin, making observations about the relationship between physical beauty and spiritual truth that would sound profound in any other context. The Lydians believe that true wisdom comes through the corruption of innocence. He tells Critias, quoting some obscure philosophical text while positioning himself with practiced efficiency, that the soul learns its deepest lessons when the body surrenders to experiences beyond its natural inclinations. Tonight we shall test this theory thoroughly. What follows represents the logical endpoint of a culture that celebrated inequality as the foundation of civilization. Athens prided itself on creating the world's first democracy. But that democracy existed only for free male citizens, roughly 15% of the population. Everyone else existed to serve their pleasure and convenience. And sexual service was considered no different from any other form of labor that slaves were expected to provide. The physical violation is accompanied by intellectual discourse that makes the experience even more surreal and traumatic. Callicrates quotes Heraclitus while inflicting pain, discusses the nature of justice while perpetrating injustice, and waxes philosophical about the beauty of youth while systematically destroying it. The cognitive dissonance would be laughable if it weren't so horrific. Men who spend their days debating virtue becoming monsters when darkness falls and wine loosens their carefully maintained public personas. By dawn, you're returned to the servant quarters like a tool that served its purpose and been cleaned for storage. The other boys in similar conditions don't speak about their experiences. partly from shame, partly from the understanding that discussing trauma only makes it more real. Instead, you all move through your daily routines with the mechanical precision of people whose spirits have learned to hide so deeply that even you sometimes forget they exist. The morning brings news that tonight's symposium was considered particularly successful. Word spreads through Athens's elite circles about the quality of entertainment Critias provides, generating requests from other wealthy citizens who want to sample his collection of beautiful boys. Your reputation as particularly compliant and aesthetically pleasing makes you increasingly valuable, a development that fills you with dread rather than pride. Greek sexual practices weren't limited to the exploitation of male slaves. Women faced their own forms of systematic abuse within a culture that viewed them as perpetual minors requiring male supervision. Athenian wives were expected to remain in domestic seclusion, rarely appearing in public and never participating in the intellectual discourse that defined civilized society. Their sexual experiences were entirely controlled by fathers and husbands, who viewed female pleasure as irrelevant to the primary purpose of reproduction. The famous hetairai, educated courtesans who provided intellectual companionship alongside sexual services, represented the closest thing to sexual agency available to women in ancient Greece. Yet even these supposedly privileged women were essentially high-class prostitutes whose freedom existed only within carefully defined boundaries. They could engage in philosophical discussions and artistic pursuits, but ultimately, their value remained tied to their ability to please male clients who held absolute power over their fate. Religious festivals provided additional venues for sexual practices that modern society would find deeply disturbing. The Dionysiac mysteries involved ritualized sexual activities that were supposed to produce spiritual enlightenment through physical ecstasy. Participants engaged in group sexual activities, cross-dressing ceremonies, and other practices that challenged conventional social boundaries while reinforcing fundamental power structures. These weren't spontaneous expressions of religious fervor, but carefully orchestrated events that allowed elite citizens to engage in sexual behaviors that would be scandalous in normal circumstances. The religious framework provided cover for activities that might otherwise face social censure, while the mystery cult structure ensured that only those with proper social connections could participate. The cult of Artemis at Ephesus involved young girls serving as temple prostitutes before marriage. Their sexual initiation framed as religious dedication rather than exploitation. Parents actually paid for the privilege of having their daughters participate in these ceremonies, viewing temporary prostitution as preparation for their eventual roles as wives and mothers. The psychological damage inflicted on these children was considered irrelevant compared to the supposed spiritual benefits of their service. Even marriage customs reflected the casual acceptance of what we would now recognize as systematic sexual abuse. Athenian brides were typically between 12 and 15 years old when wed to men who might be twice their age or older. These weren't love matches, but economic arrangements designed to transfer property and establish political alliances between families. The bride's consent was never considered. Her father simply selected the husband who offered the best economic or social advantages. Wedding ceremonies included rituals that explicitly celebrated the bride's transition from virginity to sexual availability. The breaking of pottery symbolized the destruction of her maidenhood, while various fertility rites emphasized her new role as a vessel for producing legitimate heirs. The psychological trauma of these forced sexual initiations was ignored in favor of celebrating the successful completion of another property transaction. As your months in Critias's household accumulate into years, you watch newer boys arrive and undergo the same systematic breaking that once destroyed your own innocence. The cycle perpetuates itself with mechanical precision. Children torn from families, stripped of identity, conditioned to accept abuse as normal, and eventually discarded when age diminishes their appeal to buyers of youth and beauty. Some boys don't survive the psychological pressure, they simply stop eating. Stop responding to commands. Stop existing in any meaningful sense while their bodies continue to function. Others develop the calculating ruthlessness necessary to exploit newer arrivals, becoming predators themselves, as the only alternative to remaining perpetual prey. A few, the lucky ones, die young enough to escape the worst corruptions that await those who live long enough to fully understand their situation. You've learned to navigate this world by becoming exactly what your masters want: beautiful, compliant, and hollow enough that their use of your body doesn't destroy whatever essential part of yourself you've managed to preserve. It's a survival strategy that works until it doesn't, until the day when maintaining that protective emptiness becomes more exhausting than simply surrendering to the horror completely. The Athens that produced Socrates and Plato, that gave birth to democracy and rational philosophy, that created art and architecture still celebrated today. This same Athens built its achievements on a foundation of systematic sexual exploitation that consumed thousands of young lives, while their abusers congratulated themselves on their cultural superiority. The marble columns still stand. The philosophical texts still inspire. But the screams of their victims echo through history for anyone willing to listen. Tonight, as another symposium begins above your chamber and familiar footsteps approach your door, you close your eyes and try to remember your mother's face. But memory, like innocence, is another casualty of a civilization that confused sophistication with morality, intellectual achievement with human decency. The boy who once played in mountain streams belongs to a different world now, one that exists only in dreams that grow fainter with each passing season. The oil on your skin catches the torchlight as the door opens once again and Athens prepares to celebrate another evening of what it calls the highest form of love.